Hi, welcome back to Storytime. So there is a little bit of a change in schedule. It won't affect today. We will still be doing 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, Part 8. So you'll get to hear me stumble over some more words. And then afterwards, of course, another game stream. I'm hoping to do Luna. I'm hoping to get past that, opening that bud up and continuing with the game. But tomorrow I will also be streaming, and tomorrow will be our we will be completing Phantom of the Opera, which I'm having such a blast. I forgot how much I love this book. And I was also thinking the original Phantom of the Opera movie, silent movie with Lon Chaney, that is also public domain. It is available to watch for free in its entirety on YouTube. And I was thinking we could do a bit of a watch along. So yeah, we'll see how we can manage that. I have some ideas. Yeah, but we can talk about that later, have some discussions on Twitter and Discord. In the meantime, it looks like we might have 2 or 3 more streams for 20,000 Leagues. It is a long book. Or I suppose I should say a dense book. But things are getting really interesting here. So without any further ado, too late, let us continue with 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. Chapter 9, A Submerged Continent. The next morning, 19th February, Ned Land entered my room. I rather expected him. He wore a very disappointed look. "Well, monsieur," he said. "Well, Ned, fate was adverse today." "Yes, because that damned captain stopped exactly at the hour we were about to get into that boat." "Yes, Ned, he had some business to transact with his banker." "His banker? Or rather, I should say his banking house. I mean that by this ocean, in which his treasures are more safe than in the coffers of a state." I then narrated the occurrences of the previous evening, in the secret hope to bring him back to the idea not to abandon the captain, but my recital had no other result than to cause him to regret, in the most energetic manner of which he was capable, which was something, of not having been able to make a little excursion on his own account into the battlefield of Vigo. "However," he said, "all is not lost yet. It is only a cast lost. We will recoup ourselves another time, and this evening—" "How's the ship's head?" I asked. "I don't know," he replied. "Well, tomorrow at noon we shall see the observation." The Canadian returned to Conseil. So soon as I was dressed, I entered the saloon. The compass did not give us any hope. The course was south-southeast. We were turning our backs on Europe. I waited with some impatience till the bearings were taken. About 7:30, the reservoirs were emptied, and we mounted to the surface of the ocean. I hastened up to the platform. Ned Land had anticipated me. Land was no longer in view. Nothing was to be seen but the expanse of ocean. There were a few sails on the horizon seeking at Cape St. Roque, favorable winds to double the cape. The weather was overcast. A storm was brewing. Ned, in rage, attempted to pierce the misty horizon. He had in hopes still that behind all this cloud there might be some land for which he was so anxious. At midday the sun showed himself for an instant. The mate profited by this burst to take the elevation. Then the sea got up again. We descended accordingly, and the panels were closed. An hour afterward, when I was looking at the chart, I saw that the positions of the Nautilus was 16 degrees 17 minutes longitude and 33 degrees 22 minutes latitude, about 150 leagues from the nearest shore. There was no chance even to think of escape, and I may fairly leave you to guess the feelings of Ned Land when we fully recognize the situation of things. I did not worry myself particularly. I felt in a manner relieved from a weight that had oppressed me, and I was able to return to my usual occupations with some degree of calmness. About 12 p.m. I received a very unexpected visit from Captain Nemo. He inquired very politely whether I felt fatigued by my exertions of the preceding evening. I replied in the negative. "Then, monsieur, I will suggest a very interesting excursion." "By all means," I said. "Hitherto you have only visited the ocean depths by day, and with the light of the sun. Should you like to see them on a dark night?" "Very much indeed." "I warn you the excursion will be tiring. We shall have to walk for a long distance and scale a mountain. The roads are not very well marked." "What you say only redoubles my curiosity. I am quite ready to accompany you." "Come along, then," replied the captain. "Let us put on our diving dresses." As we reached the room in which the dresses were kept, I perceived that none of the crew, nor had either of my companions, been selected to follow us on this excursion. Captain Nemo had not proposed my taking either Conseil or Ned. We were ready in a few minutes. We shouldered a reservoir of air each, but the electric lamps were not prepared. I called the captain's attention to this. "They would be of no use," he said. I fancied I was mistaken, but I could not repeat the suggestion, for the captain had already put on his helmet. I managed to equip myself, and I felt somebody put an iron-pointed stick into my hand, and some moments later we touched the bottom of the Atlantic, at a depth of 300 yards. Midnight was at hand. The water was very dark, but Captain Nemo pointed to a reddish gleam in the distance, a sort of extended light which burned at about 2 miles distant from the Nautilus. What this fire was, how it was fed, why and how it burned amid the waters, I could not hazard a conjecture. In any case, it gave us light, vaguely 'tis true, but I soon became accustomed to the peculiar obscurity, and I understood the inutility of the Ruhmkorff apparatus under the circumstances. We advanced side by side directly towards the fire. The flat ground mounted gradually. We made very long strides, assisted by our sticks, but still our progress was not rapid, for our feet often sank into this sort of ooze. But still advancing, I heard a sort of pattering noise overhead. This sometimes increased until it sounded like a hailstorm. I soon understood the cause. It was the raindrops falling upon the surface of the waves. Instinctively, I had an idea that I should get very wet. Wetted by rainwater in the middle of the sea, I could not refrain from a quiet chuckle inside my helmet at the idea, but as a fact, in the thick diver's dress, one does not feel the water and can fancy oneself in an atmosphere only a little more dense than the terrestrial atmosphere, that's all. After half an hour's walking, the ground became stony. Medusae, small crustacea, etc., lit up with their light phosphorescent gleams. I caught glimpses of piles of rock covered with millions of zoophytes and algae. My foot, oh my goodness. My foot often slipped upon the viscous carpet of barec, and had it not been for my bâton, I should have fallen more than once. When I turned round, I could see the white lamp of the Nautilus, though paling a little, in the distance. These stony heaps of which I have spoken were disposed at the bottom of the ocean with a degree of regularity which I could not explain. I saw gigantic furrows which lost themselves in the obscurity, and whose length exceeded all computation. Other curious experiences presented themselves. It appeared to me that my heavy leaden soles crushed a litter of bony fragments, which cracked with a loud noise. What was this vast plain which I was treading? I should have liked to ask the captain, but his language of signs, which permitted communication with his companions when they accompanied him in his submarine excursions, was utterly incomprehensible to me. Meanwhile, the flame which guided us increased and lighted up the horizon. The existence of this fire beneath the ocean puzzled me considerably. Was it electric? Was I about to become acquainted with a natural phenomenon hitherto unknown? Or had the power of man aught to do with this? Were men fanning this flame? Was I about to meet in those depths friends and companions of Captain Nemo, living like him this strange life, and whom he was about to visit? Should we find here below a colony of exiles who, tired of earth and its troubles, had sought and found independence in the lowest depths of the ocean? These foolish and utterly absurd ideas pressed upon me, and in my condition of mind, overexcited by the wonders I beheld at every step, I should not have been very much astonished to enter, at the bottom of this ocean, one of those submarine towns of which Captain Nemo dreamed. Our route got more and more illuminated. The white gleams radiated from a mountain about 800 feet in height, but what I could see was only a reflection thrown up by the crystal of the sea depths. The fire, the original cause of this extraordinary illumination, lay in the opposite side of the hill. Captain Nemo advanced amid the rocky masses without the least hesitation. He evidently was acquainted with the dark road. He had doubtless frequently traversed it, and would not lose his way. I followed him in full confidence. He seemed to me like one of those genii of the sea, as he walked in front, I admired his lofty stature, which was thrown out in strong relief against the luminous horizons. Sorry, looking for something. Here it is. It was 1 a.m. We reached the first slopes of the mountain, but to cross them we were obliged to attempt a difficult path in a vast thicket. Yes, a thicket of dead trees, mineralized by the action of the water, were here and there a gigantic pine dome dominating them. It was like a standing coal pit, whose ramifications, like cutting upon black paper, stood out clearly against the watery ceiling. It was like a submerged forest of the hearts clinging at the fucus, amongst which crawled... Oh no, that was wrong. It was like a submerged forest of the hearts, clinging to the mountainsides. The paths were encumbered with algae and fucus, amongst which crawled a whole colony of crustacea. I went on jumping over the rocks, striding over the tree trunks, breaking away the bindweed that extended from branch to branch and frightened the fish. Carried onwards, I felt no weariness. I followed my guide, who knew no fatigue. And what a sight it was! How can I reproduce it? How can I depict the aspect of those trees and rocks in this liquid medium, the black foundations, while red-tinged tops glowed in the night, which was redoubled by the reflecting powers of the waters? We clambered up rocks which gave way as we passed, and fell with the roar of an avalanche. Right and left there were also dark galleries. In other places were vast clear spaces, apparently man's handiwork, and I considered whether some inhabitant of these submarine districts would not suddenly appear. Captain Nemo still kept ascending, and I could not stay. I followed him broadly. My baton was a great assistance. A false step would have been dangerous on these narrow places, but I walked carefully and without feeling giddy. Sometimes I was obliged to jump a crevasse, the depth of which would have repelled me on land. Sometimes I ventured across the unsteady trunk of a tree, thrown over an abyss and without looking to my feet, for my eyes were fully occupied in admiring the wild scenery. Monumental-like rocks, perched upon irregular bases, here seemed to defy all laws of equilibrium. Between their stony embraces, trees sprang up like a jet under the influence of great pressure, and sustained those which sustained them in turn. Then natural towers and escarpments, which inclined at an angle that gravitation would never have permitted on land. Hi, Drink, how are you doing? Enjoy your lurk. I myself felt the influence of the great density of the water, for, notwithstanding my heavy clothing, I was able to scale these stiff ascents with the lightness and ease of a chamois. In thus narrating my expedition under water, I am aware that it may appear incredible. I am merely the historian of these apparently impossible, but nonetheless real and incontestable. Yeah. That was a weird turn of phrase. I don't know why. I did not dream all of these things. I saw and came in contact with them. 2 hours after leaving the Nautilus, we had cleared the line of trees, and the mountain, 100 feet above us, threw a long shadow upon the opposite slope. Some petrified trees appeared to move in fantastic zigzags. Fishes rose in masses under our feet, like frightened birds in the long grass. The massive rocks were seamed with immense fissures, deep grottos, unfathomable holes in which formidable creatures were moving about. The blood went back to my heart when I perceived an enormous antennae blocking up the way, or a frightful claw shutting with a loud noise in the depths of the cavern. Thousands of luminous points glittered in the darkness. These were the eyes of enormous crustacea, giant lobsters holding themselves upright like so many halberdiers, and moving their claws with a clacking sound. Titanic crabs and fearful octopi waving their arms like a nest full of serpents. What was the extraordinary world which hitherto I had never known? To what order did these articulates belong, for whom the rocks formed a second carapace? Where had nature discovered the secret of these vegetative life, and how long, how many centuries, had they lived thus in the lowest depths of the ocean? But I was unable to halt. Captain Nemo, evidently familiar with those terrible creatures, paid no heed to them, so we reached the first platform, where there were other surprises in store for me. There were scattered ruins which betrayed the hand of man, not of the Creator. Amongst the piles of stones rose the vague forms of chateaux and temples, clothed with zoophytes in full flower, and over which, like ivy, the Algaean fucus threw a thick vegetable mantle. I would have fain asked Captain Nemo for an explanation of all of this, but not being able to do so, I stopped and seized his arm. But he shook his head and, pointing to the last peak of the mountain, motioned me onward. I followed, and in a few minutes we gained the top, which, in a circle of 10 yards, commanded the whole of the rocky expanse beneath. I looked down the ascent as we had just climbed. The mountain was only about 700 feet high from that plain we had left, but on the other side it looked down twice the height to the depths of the Atlantic. My gaze roamed over a vast space lighted up by a violent conflagration. The mountain was, in fact, a volcano. 50 feet below the summit, a large crater was vomiting torrents of lava in the midst of a rain of stones and scoriae. The volcano lit up the plain below like an immense torch even to the limits of the horizon. I have said that the volcano cast up lava but no flames. To have flame, oxygen of the air is necessary, and flame cannot be developed under water. But lava possesses in itself the principle of incandescence, and reaches a white heat, and in contrast with the liquid element, gains the upper hand and vaporizes it. Rapid currents, carrying all the gases in diffusion, and the lava torrents flowed to the base of the mountain, like the eruptions of Vesuvius upon another Torre del Greco. In fact, beneath my eyes, ruined and destroyed, appeared the remains of a town, its roof opened, its temples fallen, its architecture gone, and in the columns still remaining, the Tuscan style could be recognized. Further on were the traces of a gigantic aqueduct, and again the base of an acropolis, with the dim outlines of Parthenon. Here were vestiges of a quay, as if an ancient harbor had been existent and had sunk, with its merchantmen and ships of war at the bottom. At a greater distance still were long lines of sunken trees and streets, a Pompeii engulfed in the ocean. Where was I? I was determined to know at my hazard. I wished to speak and would have taken off my helmet had not Captain Nemo stopped me by a gesture. He then picked up a piece of chalky stone, and advancing toward a black rock, he wrote the single word, Atlantis. A sudden light flashed through my mind. Atlantis, the ancient metropolis of Theopompus, the Atlantis of Plato, the continent whose existence was denied by Origen, Porphyrius, Jamblichus, D'Anville, Maltebrun, and Humboldt, who ranked its disappearance among the old legends. Admitted by Posidonius, Pliny, Tertullian, Engel, Scherer, Tournefort, Buffon, D'Avezac, there it was now before my eyes, bearing witness to the catastrophe. The region thus engulfed lay astride Europe, Asia, and Africa. Beyond the Pillars of Hercules, beyond the Pillars of Hercules, in which lived a people, the powerful Atlantides, against whom was waged the first battles of ancient Greece. Plato himself is the historian who has recounted the events of the heroic times. One day Solon was conversing with some aged sages of Sais, a town then 800 years old, as its graven annals bear witness. One of the old men was narrating the history of another town more ancient still. This first Athenian city, 800 years old, had been attacked and partly destroyed by the Atlantides. These people occupied an immense continent, greater than Africa and Asia put together, which covered a surface between the 12 degrees and 14 degrees north latitude. Their domination extended over to Egypt, and they wished to conquer Greece also, but were repulsed by the indomitable resistance they met with. Centuries rolled on. A cataclysm occurred. Inundations and earthquakes. A night and a day sufficed for the destruction of the Atlantis. The highest summits, Madeira, the Azores, the Canaries, and the Cape Verde Islands, only remained above the water. Such were the historical souvenirs which Captain Nemo's inscription called up in my mind. Thus, led by the strangest destiny, I was standing upon one of the mountains of that continent. I was touching these ruins 1,000 centuries old and of the geological epoch. I was walking in places where the contemporaries of the first man had walked. I was crushing under my foot the skeleton of animals of a fabulous age, which the trees, now mineralized, once covered with their shade. If time had not failed me, I should have descended those steep hills and explored the whole continent, which no doubt unites Africa to America, and visited the grand antediluvian cities. Here lived those gigantic races of old who were able to move those blocks which still resisted the action of the water. Some day, perhaps, a convulsion of nature will have these ruins up again. Many submarine volcanoes have been reported in this portion of the ocean, and many ships have felt extraordinary shocks in passing over these disturbed paths. The whole of the soil to the equator is still rent by these plutonic forces, and who knows but that at some distant day the summits of these volcanic mountains will appear once more above the surface of the Atlantic. As I was musing thus, the endeavor to fix the details on my memory, Captain Nemo remained immovable, and as if petrified. Was he thinking of some former generations and endeavoring to elucidate the secret of human destiny? Was it to this place he came to revel in historical memories, and to revive the ancient life, he to whom a modern one was distasteful? What would I not have given to have known his thoughts, to share them, to understand them? He remained in the same place for a whole hour, contemplating the vast plain by the gleam of the lava, which at times glowed with immense brilliancy. Loud noises were clearly transmitted by the water, and were echoes with majestic fullness of sound. The moon now appeared across the waters and threw her pale rays over the engulfed continent. It was but a gleam, but it had a wonderful effect. The captain rose, threw a last look at the immense plain, and then signaled me to return. We rapidly descended the mountain. The mineral forest once passed, we could perceive the lantern of the Nautilus shining in the distance like a star. The captain made directly for it, and we got on board just as the first rays of dawn were brightening the surface of the ocean. Chapter 10. The Submarine Coalfields. I awoke very late next morning, the 20th February. I dressed quickly and hastened to ascertain the course of the Nautilus. The instruments indicated a southerly direction at a speed of 20 miles, and at 100 yards below the surface. Conseil entered. I related to him the incidents of our nocturnal excursion, and the panels being open, we could catch a glimpse of the sunken continent. In fact, the Nautilus was only about 10 yards from the bottom of the Atlantic, and skimmed along like a balloon, hurried across the terrestrial prairies, but it would be more correct to say that we were apparently in a saloon carriage of an express train. The first objects that we passed were fantastically splintered rock forests, which had been changed from the vegetable to the animal kingdom, and whose unmovable outline was shadowed beneath the waves. Stony masses hidden beneath the carpet of axides and anemones, bristling with long vertical hydrophytes and strangely twisted blocks of lava, which attested the fury of the eruptions. While these strange things were clearly observable under our electric light, I made Conseil acquainted with the history of the Atlantides, which, from a purely imaginative point of view, inspired Bailey with material for many charming pages. But Conseil appeared somewhat indifferent to my wish to discuss these questions respecting ancient Atlantis, and this indifference was soon explained. So many fish passed before him, and when fish were in the way, Conseil plunged into the depths of classification and went out of the world altogether. In this case, I could only yield and study with him. The fish of the Atlantic, as a rule, do not differ much from those we have already noticed. There were gigantic rays, various kinds of sharks, a glaucus about 15 feet long with sharp triangular teeth, brown sager, humanterous sturgeons, trumpet signathus, about 1.5 feet long, without tongue or teeth, which swam like beautiful and lithesome serpents. Amongst the bony fishes, Conseil noticed the black mocaras, 9 feet long, and armed with a long, sharp sword in the upper jaw. Other colored animals, known in the days of Aristotle as the sea dragons, whose spikes and sharp dorsal fin make it dangerous to grasp with the bare hands. Coryphines, whose brown backs were prettily striped with blue and surrounded by a golden edging. Beautiful dorades also, and troops of enormous swordfish, fierce animals, some of them more than 24 feet in length. They are more herbivorous than carnivorous, and the males obeyed the slightest gesture of the female fish, as well-trained husbands should do. But all this time I did not fail to examine the long plains of Atlantis. Sometimes the nature of the bottom obliged the Nautilus to slacken speed, and it glided with the dexterity of a cetacean amongst the scattered hillocks. If the labyrinth appeared inextricable, the vessel rose like a balloon, and the obstacle overcome it, resumed its course at the lower level. An admirable and charming way of sailing, which recalled a balloon voyage, with the difference that the Nautilus always obeyed the hand of the steersman. About 4 p.m., the appearance of the soil, hitherto composed of thick mud and petrified wood, began to change. It was more stony now, and sprinkled with conglomerate and basaltic lumps, with lava and sulphurous obsidian. I fancied that a mountainous region would soon succeed the plains, and at a movement of the Nautilus, I perceived the southern horizon was barred by a high wall, which appeared to block all further progress. The summit of this was evidently above the sea levels. It must be a continent or an island, presumed perhaps one of the Canaries or Cape Verde Islands. The observations not having yet been taken, perhaps designedly omitted. I lost my place. Oh no. Sorry about this. The summit of this was evidently above the sea level. It must be a continent or an island, perhaps the Canaries or Cape Verde Isles. The observations not having yet been taken, perhaps designedly omitted, I was ignorant of our position. At any rate, this wall appeared to me to mark the limit of Atlantis, only a very small portion of which we had traversed after all. Night put an end to my observations. I was left alone. Conseil had retired to his cabin. The Nautilus slackened speed. Sometimes it passed over high ground, sometimes it almost touched bottom, and at times it rose capriciously to the surface of the ocean. I could have remained much longer at the window, but the panels were closed. The Nautilus had now reached the high wall. What would be done now? I gained my room. The Nautilus did not move. I went to sleep with a determination to wake after an hour or two. But it was 8 o'clock next morning when I re-entered the saloon. I perceived by the manometer that the Nautilus was floating on the surface. Besides, I could hear a noise upon the platform. Nevertheless, no rolling motion betokened that we were lying at the surface of the water. I ascended to the deck panel. It was open. But instead of the daylight I expected, all around was dark. Where were we? Had I made a mistake and it was still night? No, not a star glittered, and no night is so absolutely dark. I did not know what to think of this when a voice close to me said, "Ah, Professor, is that you?" "Oh, Captain Nemo!" I cried. "Where are we?" "Underground," he replied. "Underground? And the Nautilus afloat too?" "It always does float," replied the captain. "I do not understand," I said. "Wait a minute or two and you will. Our lantern will soon be lighted, and if you make light, you will then be satisfied." I accordingly waited. The darkness was so thick that I could not even see Captain Nemo. Nevertheless, just exactly overhead, I fancied I could detect a glimmer of twilight coming through a circular hole. At this moment the lamp was lighted, and its strong light quite extinguished the gleam overhead. I looked round me so soon as I could accustom my eyes to the sudden change from the darkness. The Nautilus did not move. It was floating alongside a mountain like an enormous quay. The water in which it floated formed a lake enclosed within a circle of rocky walls about 2 miles in diameter. The level indicated by the manometer was only that the exterior sea level, for communication, of course, existed between the lake and the ocean. The high rocks leant over and united in a vaulted roof about 500 or 600 yards above us. At the top was a circular hole through which I had caught that gleam of daylight. "Where are we?" I asked. "At the heart of an extinct volcano," replied the captain. "Of a volcano to which the sea was admitted by some great natural convulsion. While you were asleep, the Nautilus entered the lagoon by a channel which opens about 10 yards below the surface of the ocean. This is our harbor of refuge, sure, safe, commodious and mysterious, perfectly sheltered. Can you find me any harbor in the world so completely out of the reach of all storms? You are certainly in perfect safety here, Captain. Who could reach you in the center of a volcano? Is there not an opening at the top? Yes, the crater, which now gives passage to the air we breathe. But what is this volcano? It belongs to one of the numerous islands scattered in this sea, a rock for all vessels save mine. For us, an enormous cavern. I discovered it by chance, and in that fate befriended me. But can no one descend through the crater? I asked. No more than I can ascend it, for 100 feet up the interior base of the mountain is practicable, but above the cliffs are perpendicular, and they cannot be scaled. I see, Captain, that nature helps you everywhere and in everything. You are in perfect safety here, and no one can intrude in these waters. But what is the good of it all? After all, the Nautilus does not require a harbor. No, but it requires electricity to move it, and the elements to make the electricity. Sodium to supply those elements, carbon to make the sodium, and coal to extract the carbon. In this very spot, the sea covers entire forests, which are embedded during the geological period, now mineralized and become coal, an inexhaustible mine for me. Your crew became miners here, then, Captain? Certainly. These mines extend beneath the waves like the Newcastle colliers. Here, in these divers' dresses, with picks and shovel, my men dig the coal out, which I do not ask from terrestrial mines. When I burnt it to make sodium, the smoke escapes by the crater, which makes the mountain appear as an active volcano. I don't know, they're just fishing. Shall we see your companions at work? I asked. Well, not this time, for I am in a hurry to continue our voyage, so I will only draw the sodium from my reserves. We only allow a day to put it on board, so if you wish to see the cavern and make a tour of the lagoon, you had better take advantage of that day, Monsieur Anorax. I thanked the captain and sought my companions, who had not yet left their cabin. I invited them to accompany me, but did not tell them where we were. They descended to the platform. Conseil, who had never astonished at anything, looked upon it as quite a natural thing to wake up in the center of a mountain, having gone to sleep while under water. But Ned Land thought of nothing but finding an exit. After breakfast, about 6 o'clock, we landed. Well, here we are on land again, said Conseil. I don't call this land, replied Ned, and besides, we are not on land, we are underneath it. Between the mountainside and the lake ran a sandy ridge about 500 feet wide at its greatest breadth. We could easily walk round the lake upon this shore. At the base of the rocks was a rough soil, upon which, in picturesque confusion, lay volcanic blocks and enormous pumice boulders. All these masses, polished as they were by the action of fire, shone under the gleam of our electric lights. The micaceous dust flew around like sparks. The ground ascended as we left the margin, and we soon arrived at long inclined plains or slopes, but we were obliged to step carefully amongst these loose conglomerates, upon which the feet often slipped. The truly volcanic nature of the place was everywhere observable, and I pointed it out to Ned and Conseil. Can you imagine, I asked, what this crater must have been when choked with boiling lava, and when the level of the boiling liquid rose to the aperture of the mountain? I can imagine quite well, replied Conseil, but will Monsieur tell me why the great founder has suspended this operation, and how it is that the furnace is filled with the tranquil waters of a lake? Most likely, I replied, because some convulsion of nature produced the opening through which the Nautilus entered. the waters of the Atlantic, which deluged the interior of the mountain. It must have been a terrible struggle between the elements. But Neptune gained the day. Many ages have elapsed since then, and the submerged volcano is now a peaceful grotto. "All right, sir," said Ned. "I will accept the explanation, but I should have preferred, for our sakes, that the opening of which you speak had been above the sea level." "But, friend Ned," replied Conseil, "if the passage were not submarine, the Nautilus would not have been able to enter it. And I may add that, if the water had not rushed in under the mountain, the volcano would have remained in activity, so your regrets are altogether superfluous." We continued to ascend. The slopes became more and more narrow and perpendicular. There were many deep crevasses, which we had obliged to cross. Overhanging rocks had to be turned. We crawled on our knees and even on our stomachs, but Conseil's skill and Ned's strength succeeded in surmounting all obstacles. At a height of about 90 feet, the nature of the ground underwent an alteration, though it became no more predictable for us. Black basalt succeeded the conglomerates and trachytes, the former in these extended surface, sprinkled with bubbles, the latter in prisms, placed like a colonnade, an admirable specimen of nature's architecture. Amongst the basalt wound streams of cold lava encrusted with bituminous rays, and in places there were quantities of sulfur. A strong gleam entered by the crater and lit up vaguely the eruptive remains buried forever in the bosom of the mountain. But our ascent was soon arrested at the height of about 250 feet. A vault overhung our heads, and our ascent gave way to a circuitous walk. We were the vegetable kingdom, struggling with the minerals. Some shrubs and even a few trees appeared in the fissures. I saw some euphorbias, with the caustic juice exuding from them, some heliotropes, quite unable to justify their name since the sun never reached them, drooped their flowers, both scent and color being half gone. A few chrysanthemums gushed their timid way up to the stems of the aloes, with their sad and sickly leaves, but amid the lava I perceived some little violets, still scented, and I confess that I inhaled their perfume with delight. Perfume is the soul of a flower. The sea flowers, the splendid hydrophytes, have no souls. We had reached some fine dragon trees, which had thrust away the stones by their strong roots, when Ned said, "Look here! Here's a hive!" "A hive!" "Hive?" I exclaimed incredulously. "Yes, a hive, and the bees humming around it, too." I approached, and I was bound to confess the fact. There it was, in a hole in the dragon tree, inhabited by some thousands of bees, so common in the Canary Isles, where their produce is held in particular high estimation. The Canadian naturally wished to lay in a stock of honey, and I was loath to prevent him. He soon got together some leaves, and with a quantity of sulphur he began to fumigate the bees. The humming gradually subsided, and the hive yielded several pounds of excellent honey, which Ned placed in his haversack. "When I have mixed the honey with the paste of atrocarpus," he said, "I shall be ready to offer you an excellent cake." "By Jove," said Conseil, "that will be like gingerbread." "Bother the gingerbread," I said. "Let us continue our excursion." At various turns of the path, we had the view of the lake from end to end. The lantern lit up the whole of the unruffled surface. The Nautilus was perfectly motionless. The crew were at work at the side of the mountain and upon the platform, like black shadows clearly defined against the light. At this time we were rounding the highest crests of the most elevated of the first pillars of rock supporting the vaulted roof. I then saw that the bees were not the only representative of animal life in the volcano. Birds of prey flew hither and thither in the obscurity, or rose from their nests on the pinnacles of rock. There were sparrow-hawks and kestrels, several bustards scampered down the slopes. You can imagine how Ned's mouth watered at the sight of this game, and how he regretted he had no gun with him. He endeavored to make up for the absence of lead with stones, and, after several misses, he did manage to disable a splendid bustard. It is only right to say that he risked his life 20 times in his endeavors to secure it, but he succeeded, at length, in pouching the bird along with the honey. We had to descend towards the shore, for the crest had become impracticable. Overhead the crater gaped like a great pit shaft, and we could see the sky distinctly, and the clouds flying to the eastward, leaving mist on the mountain as they passed. Half an hour later we gained the inner shore. Here the flora was represented by marine crystal, a little umbelliferous plant, very good for picking, and also known as sea fennel. Conseil picked some. The fauna were represented by thousands of crustacea of all kinds, lobsters, crabs, spider crabs, etc., etc. Here we lighted upon a beautiful grotto. We stretched out ourselves gladly upon the smooth, fine sand. Ned Land amused me by sounding the rocky sides with the view to ascertain their thickness. The conversation turning upon the everlasting project of escape, and I believed I was justified, without starting so absolutely, to give Ned hope by telling him that Captain Nemo had only come down south to renew his supply of sodium. I hoped that now he would return to the European and American coasts, and give the Canadian the opportunity to put his scheme into execution with success. We stayed in the grotto for more than an hour, but as the conversation languished, sleep stole over us. We slept, and I dreamt that I was a mollusk, and that the grotto formed the two valves of my shell. Suddenly I was awakened by Conseil. "Get up! Get up!" he cried. "What is the matter?" I said, sitting up. "The water is rising." I jumped up. The sea was rushing into the grotto like a sluice, and as we were not really mollusks, I was advisable to save ourselves. In a few moments we were safe in the summit of the grotto. "What is the cause of that? Some new phenomenon?" asked Conseil. "Oh, no," I replied. "It is only the tide that has surprised us, like Walter Scott's hero. The ocean has risen, and, of course, this lake must rise to the same level. We have escaped with a little wetting only. Let us go on. We can change on board." 3/4 of an hour later, we had finished our circular tour and got back to the Nautilus. The crew had finished embarking the sodium, and the Nautilus could start at once. However, the captain gave no order to that effect. Perhaps he wished to wait till nightfall and pass secretly through the secret canal. Whatever the reason was, the next day the Nautilus was clear of her harbor and, far from land, was skimming along some yards beneath the surface of the Atlantic. I'm going to take just a little break because we're between chapters. I hope you're feeling better, Drink. That you slept well and things have settled. And I actually used to get a few more bots than I do nowadays. They just like to put out their feelers, try to get you. And usually I don't mind, but it is a little distracting when reading, because I like to say hi to people as they come in. And then sometimes I lose my place. That kind of took me off guard. But it's all good. Chapter 11. The Sargasso Sea. No alteration was made in the course of the Nautilus, and all hope of gaining European waters was now gone. Where Captain Nemo was hurrying, I could not imagine. That day we crossed a curious portion of the Atlantic. Everyone is acquainted with the existence of the great warm currents called the Gulf Stream. Leaving Florida, it flows towards Spitzbergen, but before entering the Gulf of Mexico, about 44 degrees north latitude, the current divides. The current divides, one branch going towards the Irish coast and up to Norway, while the other tends southward, up to the Azores. Then, touching the coast of Africa and descending the long oval, it turns again towards the Antilles. Now this second arm, or rather collar, surrounded with its warm water the portion of the cold ocean denominated the Sargasso Sea, a veritable lake in the open Atlantic, and it takes the great current no less than 3 years to encircle it. The Sargasso Sea, properly speaking, covers the submerged Atlantis. Certain authors have even admitted that the herbs with which it is strewn have been torn from the fields of that ancient continent. It is more probable, however, that these algae and fucus, loosed from the coasts of Europe and America, are carried hither by the Gulf Stream. This was one of the reasons why Columbus believed in the existence of a new world. When this hardy navigation arrived at the Sargasso Sea, the ships sailed with difficulty in the midst of the herbs to the terror of the crews, and it took 3 long weeks to get through them. Such was the region the Nautilus entered, a regular prairie, a carpet of seaweed, fucus, and berries, so thick and compact that a vessel could hardly make way through it. Captain Nemo, not wishing to get the screw entangled in the weeds, kept the Nautilus at some distance beneath the surface. This name of Sargasso is derived from the Spanish word sargazo, signifying a sea wrack, W-R-A-C-K. This wrack, or varech, is the principal constituent of this immense bank, and the following is the reason, according to Maury, why hydrophytes unite in this peaceful basin in the Atlantic. The only possible explanation, says Murray, seems to me the result of worldwide experience. If you place in the center of a vase some fragments of cork or other floating substance, and give to the water a circular motion, the fragments will unite in the center, in the least agitated part. In the phenomenon, we are considering the vase as the Atlantic, the Gulf Stream is the circular current, and the Sargasso Sea the central point where the floating bodies unite. I agree with Murray, and was enabled to study the phenomenon in the very center where ships but rarely penetrate. Overhead floated all kinds of products, trunks of trees torn from the Andes or Rocky Mountains, and floated out to the sea by the Amazon or the Mississippi, numerous wrecks, keels and hulls and planks so heavy with shells and barnacles as to be unable to float on the surface. And time will justify Maury in his other opinion that these accumulations of centuries will petrify and form inexhaustible coal fields, a valuable reserve which nature is preparing for the time when continental coal mines shall be exhausted. In the midst of this tangled mass of plants and fucus, I noticed some beautiful rose halcyaeas, trailing their long tentacles and red, green, and blue medusae, particularly the great rhizostones of Cuvier, the blue umbrella of which is bordered by a violet fringe. We passed the whole of the 22nd of February in the Sargasso Sea, where the fish, great admirers of marine plants and crustacea, found abundant food. Next day the ocean had assumed its usual appearance. For the next 19 days the Nautilus kept in mid-Atlantic, where he proceeded steadily at the rate of 100 leagues in the 24 hours. Captain Nemo had evidently determined to carry out his program, and I had no doubt that he intended, when he had doubled Cape Horn, to return to the South Pacific. Ned Land had therefore some cause for alarm. In these immense expanses of sea, with but few islands, it would not do to think of escape. Nor were there any means to oppose Captain Nemo's wishes. We could only submit, but we might gain by diplomacy what we could not attain by force or stratagem. Once the voyage was over, would not Captain Nemo restore us to our liberty, under an oath never to betray him? Nor now could I claim his liberty. He had declared that the secret of his life entailed, in return, our lasting incarceration on board the Nautilus, and would not my silence for 4 months look like a tacit acceptation of this condition? In fact, I was forced to confess that our chances of seeing our relatives again diminished more and more from the day Captain Nemo went south again. During the 19 days I have referred to, no incident of any note occurred. I saw but little of the captain. He was at work. In the library, I often found his books upon natural history left open. At this part of our voyage, we often sailed for whole days at the surface. The sea was, as it were, deserted. A few sailing vessels bound to India, via the Cape, were all we perceived. One day we were pursued by the boats of a whaler, who no doubt took us for these brave fellows who should lose both time and trouble, and so he plunged incontinently into the depths. This incident appeared of interest to Ned Land mightily. I rather think he regretted that our iron cetacean had not been captured by the fishermen. The fish we observed here were not greatly different from those we had previously noticed. The principal specimens were various kinds of sharks. We also saw tremendous dogfish, about which many extravagant stories are related by fishermen, one of which was reported to have swallowed 2 pickled tunnies, and a sailor, clothes and all, another a sailor fully equipped, and a third, a cavalier and his horse complete. But I do not think we can rank the credit for these tales among our articles of faith. At any rate, we caught none, so I could not verify even one story. Troops of dolphins accompanied us for whole days at a time, and I noticed also some curious specimens of the fish of the I'm going to try to get through this. Acanthopterygian order of the family of cyanoids. Some authors, chiefly poets, pretend that these fish sing, and their voices form quite a concert to which human voices cannot compare. I do not deny this, but at any rate we were not serenaded by them, and I am sorry for it. We also saw quantities of flying fish. Nothing can be more curious than to see the dolphins giving chase with such wonderful precision. No matter how the unfortunate fish flew, or what course he took, even across the Nautilus, he always dropped into the mouth of its pursuer. Up to the 13th of March, our voyage continued like this. On that day we took some soundings, which interested me particularly. We had made nearly 13,000 leagues since our departure from the Pacific high seas. The bearings we took gave us 45 degrees 37 minutes south latitude and 37 degrees 53 minutes east longitude. We were in the same locality where Captain Denham of the Herald gave out 14,000 yards of line without touching bottom. There also, Lieutenant Parker of the American frigate Congress did not find soundings at 15,140 degrees 40 yards. Captain Nemo resolved to bring down the Nautilus to the greatest depth to test these different soundings. I made preparation to note the results. The panels were opened and we set about reaching the depths of the ocean. One might imagine that to dive it was only a question of filling the reservoirs, but perhaps they would not be sufficient. On the other hand, perhaps the pumps were not sufficiently powerful to overcome the exterior pressure. Captain Nemo resolved to get to the bottom by a long diagonal by means of the inclined planes at the side being placed at an angle of 45 degrees. Then the screw was worked at full speed, and it beat the waves with tremendous violence. Under this tremendous pressure, the Nautilus quivered like a cord and descended straight away into the water. The captain and I, posted in the saloon, followed the movements of the manometer, which moved rapidly. We soon passed the habitable zone in which the greater numbers of fish live. I asked Captain Nemo whether he had ever observed fish at a very great depth. "Very seldom," he said, "but what does science say?" "It is known," I replied, "that towards the very low depths vegetable life disappears more quickly than the animals, and it is known that where even animated beings are met with no vegetation is observable by hydrophyte. It is known that pelerines and oysters live at 2,000 yards under the water, and that Captain McClintock, the polar hero, has brought up a living starfish from a depth of 2,500 yards. The nets of the bulldog of the Royal Navy fished up an asteroid from 2,620 fathoms. But Captain Nemo, perhaps you will say they know nothing about it." "No, Professor, I should not be so rude. And moreover, I should like you to explain how these things are able to live at such great depths." "I can give you 2 reasons," I replied. "First, because the vertical currents, determined by the difference of the saltness and density of the water, produce a movement which is sufficient to give a rudimentary life in the ecrines and asteroids." "Quite so," replied the captain. "Secondly, because if oxygen is the basis of life, we know that the quantity of oxygen contained in the sea increases with the depth instead of diminishing, and that the pressure helps to compress it." "Ah, they know that," said the captain, in a light tone of surprise. "Well, they're right. I will add that the swimming bladders of a fish contain more azote than oxygen when the animal is near the surface, and more oxygen than azote when at a greater depth. That gives your system probability. But let us continue our observations." My gaze was fixed on the manometer. The instrument indicated a depth of 6,000 yards. We had been immersed for an hour, and the Nautilus was still descending. The water was beautifully clear. An hour later we had reached 13,000 yards. About 3¼ leagues, and the bottom of the ocean had not yet been attained. At 14,000 yards I saw some black peaks rising up, but these summits appeared to be those of mountains as high as the Himalayas or Mont Blanc, or higher, and the depths appeared as far off as ever. The Nautilus still descended, notwithstanding the tremendous pressure. I felt it tremble, and the bolts seemed to start. The partitions groaned, and the windows of the saloon seemed to cave in with the enormous pressure, and the whole thing would have given way had it not been, as the captain had said, capable of resisting any possible pressure, like a solid block of iron. The last remnants of animal life soon disappeared, and at 3 leagues down, the Nautilus had passed the limits of submarine existence. We had attained a depth of 16,000 yards, 4 leagues, and the side of the Nautilus bore the pressure of 6,000 atmospheres, or 2,000 pounds about, for each 2/5 of an inch square of its surface. "What a position!" I cried. "Sailing through these profundities where humankind has never been. Look at those splendid rocks, Captain! Those uninhabited grottos, the last receptacle of the earth, where life is impossible. What unknown sights are here, and how impossible is it that we should retain any souvenir of them?" Would it please you to have a souvenir of them? Asked Captain Nemo. What do you mean? I mean that nothing is easier than to take a photograph of this submarine view. I had no time to express my surprise, for at a summons from Captain Nemo the apparatus was brought in. The water was electrically illuminated, and the perfectly distributed light could not have been surpassed by the sun's rays. The Nautilus, under the pressure of her screw, and overcome by the inclined planes, remained steady. The camera was fixed. In a few seconds we had obtained a beautiful negative. I can only give the positive proof here. The primitive rocks which have never met heaven's light, the lower granite strata which form the foundations of the earth, the deep grottos included in the stony masses, those clear profiles with black edges. Then, beyond a horizon of mountains, an admirable undulating line which makes the perspective of the picture. I cannot describe this assemblage of smooth, black, and polished rocks, and of the strange forms which glittered beneath the gleam of our electric light. When Captain Nemo had finished, he said, "Let us ascend again now. We must not go too far, nor expose the Nautilus to such a pressure." "Ascend again?" I said. "Hold tight, I advise you," said he. I had no time to understand this caution when I was thrown upon the floor. The screw was hauled in, the inclined planes pointed upwards, and the Nautilus, carried up like a balloon, rose with a fearful rapidity. It cut through the waves with a roar. Nothing whatever was visible as we ascended. In 4 minutes we had passed the 4 leagues which lay between us and the surface, and after emerging from the water like a flying fish, we fell back to float upon the waves, making the billows rise to a prodigious height as we did so. Chapter 12. Cachalots and Whales. During the night of the 13th March, the Nautilus steered towards the south. I thought that when Captain Nemo had got to the latitude of Cape Horn, he would put the helm up for the Pacific and complete his tour of the world, but he did not, and still kept his southerly course. Whither was he bound? To the pole? That was madness. I really began to think that the captain's rashness sufficiently justified the apprehension of Ned Land. The Canadian had not spoken to me respecting his plans of escape for some time. He had become less communicative, almost silent. I perceived how this long imprisonment preyed upon him. I felt that he was bottling up his indignation. Whenever he met the captain, his eyes gleamed with a fierce light, and I was always fearful that his violent temperament would impel him to make some rash action. On that day, the 14th March, Conseil had come... Did I say May earlier or March? I meant March. On that day, the 14th March, Conseil and he came to me in my room. I inquired the object of this visit. "To ask a simple question, monsieur," replied the Canadian. "Speak, Ned." "How many men do you think there are on board the Nautilus?" "I cannot tell you, my friend," I replied. "It seems to me," said Ned, "that she does not require a large crew to work her." "As a matter of fact, under present circumstances, 10 men would suffice," I replied. "Well, why should there be any more?" said Ned. "Why?" I asked. I looked steadily at Ned, whose ideas were not difficult to fathom. "Because," I continued, if my presentiments are correct, and I have understood the captain, the Nautilus is not merely a ship, it is a refuge for those who, like its commander, have broken all worldly ties." "Perhaps so," replied Conseil, "but it can only contain a certain number of men, and Conseil can give us the maximum. And Monsieur can give us the maximum." "How so, Conseil?" "By calculation. Given the capacity of the vessel, which Monsieur knows, and consequently the quantity of air it can contain, and knowing also how much each individual would require for respiration, and by comparing the result with the recurring necessity for returning to the surface for air every 24 hours. I saw at once what Conseil meant. I understand, I said, but such a calculation could give but an uncertain result. Never mind, insisted Ned Land. Well, this is the calculation, I said. Every man in 1 hour consumes the oxygen contained in 100 liters, 20 gallons, of air. So in 24 hours, that would be 480 gallons. We must now endeavor to find out how many times 480 gallons of air are contained in the Nautilus. Exactly, said Conseil. Now, I continued, the capacity of the Nautilus is 1,500 tons, and that of a ton is 200 gallons. The Nautilus, therefore, contains 300,000 gallons of air, which, divided by 480, gives 625. So the air contained in the Nautilus would suffice for 625 men for 24 hours. 625, repeated Ned. But you may take for granted that, including ourselves, crew and officers, there is not a 10th part of that number on board. But there are still too many for 3 men. I don't know what that means. But there are still too many for 3 men, muttered Conseil. Therefore, my poor Ned, I said, I can only advise you to be patient. And what is better but be resigned, said Conseil. Conseil had used the right word. After all, he resumed, Captain Nemo cannot always keep going to the south. He must stop somewhere and return into more civilized seas. It will then be time to put Ned Land's plan into action. The Canadian shook his head, passed his hand over his forehead, and went out, but did not answer. Will Monsieur permit me to make an observation? Said Conseil. Poor Ned is ever wanting that he cannot have, what he cannot have. All his past life returns to him. He regrets everything that is forbidden to us. Old memories oppress him, and he has a large heart. We must try to understand him. What has he to do here? Nothing. He is not a savant, and cannot take the same pleasure in admiring the sea as we do. He would risk all he possesses to be able to enter an inn in his own country again. It is certain the monotony of ship life had become insupportable to the Canadian, used to his active existence. Events which could rouse him up were rare. However, an incident happened that day which recalled bright days to the harpooner. About 11 a.m., being at the surface, the Nautilus fell in with a school of whales, at which I was not surprised, as I knew that the creatures hunted to death seeked refuge in the high latitudes. The part played by the whale in the marine world, and its influence upon the geographical discovery, had been considerable. It is the whale that successively induced the Basques, the Australians, the English, and the Dutch to accustom themselves to the dangers of the sea, and has led them from one end of the earth to the other. Whales frequent the Arctic and the Antarctic oceans. Ancient stories say that these cetaceans have brought fishers to within 7 leagues of the North Pole. If this be not true, it soon will be, and in their chase of the whale, men will reach this unknown point of the globe. We were sitting upon the platform. The sea was calm, but October of these latitudes gave us some lovely autumnal days. The Canadian, he could not err, signaled a whale on the horizon to the east. As we gazed attentively, we could distinguish his black back rising and falling with the sea above 5 miles of us. Ah, cried Ned, if I were only on board a whaler, there is an encounter that would do me good. It is a splendid animal. Look with what force he is spouting. Why am I bound to this iron plate? Oh, hi, Yumi. How are you doing? Sorry if you said hi a little while ago. Sometimes I just get totally locked into the story. So I am, I'll take a short break to introduce myself. I am Sunny, and I am a variety streamer specializing mostly in, the story times, but also I do kind of chill game streams and a few art streams, and I'm actually thinking of doing a watch along of one of the old silent movies, because our other story time we're doing Phantom of the Opera. So I thought it would be fun after we finished the book to do a watch through of the Lon Chaney version of Phantom of the Opera. And let me get you a quick link to my Discord where you can post up pictures, just chat. I have many pictures of cats there. And I hope you're enjoying this. Usually I stop to chat between chapters, but we're right in the middle, and I didn't want to ignore you. So I will continue for now, but I'll stop in a bit when we reach the end of a chapter. "What, Ned?" said I. "Then you have not forgotten your old tastes? Can a whale fisher ever forget his trade, sir? Can the excitement Can the excitement incident to such a chase ever die out? You have never fished in these seas, I suppose?" "Never, sir. Only in the north, in Bering's and Dave's Straits, about equally." "Then the whale of the southern sea is unknown to you. You have hitherto only hunted the Greenland whale, which would not pass the warm waters of the equator." "Ah, monsieur, what do you mean?" cried Ned in a somewhat incredulous tone. "I'm stating a fact. Well, now, for instance, I myself, in 1865, that is 2 years and a half ago, fell in with a whale near Greenland which carried another harpoon in its side, a harpoon marked as belonging to a Bering whaler. Now I ask you, how, having been struck on the west side of America, the animal could come up to be killed in the east, unless he had doubled the Cape and crossed the equator?" "I agree with you, Ned," said Conseil, "and should like to have an explanation." "Whales are localized," I replied, "according to their species, in certain seas which they do not leave, and if one of them did pass from Bering's to Dave's Straits, it is simply because some passage must exist beneath Asia or America." "Oh, hi, Snoggings. Are you going to come up? Come on." My cat is visiting me. I am doing well. How are you doing? Come on. Let's see. Must we believe that?" asked the Canadian with a wink. "We must believe, monsieur," said Conseil. "All right, then," said Ned. "And as I have never fished in these seas, I do not know the species of whale that frequent them." "I have told you so, Ned. All the more reason why we should make their acquaintance," replied Conseil. "Look, look!" cried Ned excitedly. "It is coming nearer. It is aggravating. I know that I cannot get at it. It knows that I cannot get at it." Ned stamped his foot. His hand shook as if he were brandishing a harpoon. "Are these cetaceans as big as those of the North Sea?" he asked. "Very nearly," I replied. "I have seen whales 100 feet long, and I am told that at the Aleutian Islands they have been known to exceed 150 feet in length." "That seems an exaggeration," I replied. "These animals are only Balaenopterus, provided with dorsal fins, and, like the cachalots, are usually smaller than the Greenland species." "Ah," said the Canadian, whose eyes never left the sea, "it is approaching nearer still." Then, resuming the conversation, he said, "You speak of the cachalot as a small animal, but enormous specimens have been known. They are intelligent creatures, cetaceans. Some of them, it is said, cover themselves with seaweed and are sometimes mistaken for islands. Then people land and encamp, light a fire, and also build houses on them," added Conseil, Yes, you joker, replied Ned. Then at last, some fine day, the animal takes it into his head to dive and drowns all the inhabitants. That is like the travels of Sinbad the Sailor, I said, laughing. Ah, Master Land, it appears you are fond of extravagant tales. Very like a whale, your cachalot. I hope you do not believe it. Monsieur, replied the Canadian seriously, we must believe anything about whales. Look how that fellow is going along. People say that these animals can go round the world in 15 days. I do not assert the contrary. But you are doubtless aware, Monsieur Anorex, that at the creation whales swam even more rapidly. Indeed, Ned, why is that? Because they then had their tails like fishes, vertically placed so that they struck the water from left to right and from right to left. But the Creator, perceiving that they moved too quickly, altered the tail so that it now beats the water upwards and downwards to the detriment of great speed. Good Ned, I replied, but borrowing his own expression, I added, Must we believe that? Not unless you like, he said, and not any more than I told you that there exists whales 300 feet long and 100,000 pounds weight. Well, that is something, I said. Nevertheless, it must be admitted that some cetaceans reach an enormous size, since they furnish, it is said, nearly 120 tons of oil. I have seen as much, said the Canadian. I willingly believe it, Ned, as I believe that some whales equal 100 elephants in size. Judge of the effect which would be produced by such a mass coming in contact with a vessel. Is it true that vessels are wrecked by them? Asked Conseil. No, I replied. I do not believe ships are. But a tale is told that in the year 1820, in these very seas, a whale launched itself against the Essex and rammed her backwards by the rate of 4 yards in a second. The waves entered above the stern, and the vessel sank almost immediately. Ned looked at me quizzically. I have received a blow from the tail of a whale, he said. In my boat, of course. My companions and I were flung 6 or 7 yards into the air, but beside your animal, sir, mine are but a baby. Do these animals live long? Asked Conseil. 1,000 years, replied Ned. How do you know that, Ned? Because I have been told so. And why did they tell you so? Because they knew it. No, Ned, I said, they do not know it. They only suppose so. 400 years ago, when whale fishing first began, these animals were larger than they were at present. Therefore, people suppose that the smaller size is due to the fact that they have not had time to grow to their full bulk. That caused Buffon to state that whales live 1,000 years. Do you see? Ned Land neither heard nor understood. The whale was approaching, and he was devouring him with all his eyes. Ah, he exclaimed, it is not one whale, it is a whole school, and I unable to do anything, tied here hand and foot. But friend Ned, said Conseil, why do you not ask permission to hunt them? Scarcely were the words uttered than Ned Land had descended in search of the captain. In a few moments they appeared together. Captain Nemo looked at the whales, which were spouting about a mile away. They are southern whales, he said, and would make the fortune of a whaling fleet. Well then, monsieur, may we not chase them, if it be for nothing else than to keep my hand in? For what object? Replied the captain. Simply for the sake of killing. We have no use for oil on board. Nevertheless, in the Red Sea you permitted us to kill the dugong. It was then with a view to procure fresh meat for my crew. Here it is only killing for killing's sake. I know very well it is man's privilege, but I do not like killing for pastime. In destroying the southern whales, like the Greenland whale, inoffensive and useful animals, people like you, Master Land, are very culpable. They have already decimated them in Baffin's Bay, and a class of useful animals is being annihilated. Leave these poor cetaceans alone. They have plenty of natural enemies, cachalots, swordfish, and sawfish, without you. I leave you to imagine what a figure the Canadian cut during this homily. To talk like that to a hunter was to throw words away. Ned gazed at the captain and evidently did not understand him. Nevertheless, the captain was right. The barbarous and indiscriminate fishing will soon clear off all the whales from the ocean. Ned Land whistled Yankee Doodle, thrust his hands into his pocket, and turned his back on us. Captain Nemo continued to watch the cetaceans, and turning to me, said, "I was right in saying that without counting man, whales had enemies enough. Those will have enough to occupy them soon. Do you see those black moving spots about 8 miles to leeward, Monsieur Anorax?" "Yes," I replied. "Those are cachalots, terrible animals, too. I have sometimes met them in schools of 200 or 300 at a time. They're cruel creatures, and one will do well to kill them." The Canadian turned quickly. "Well, Captain, there is still time, even in the interest of the whales. It is no use to expose oneself. The Nautilus will suffice to disperse them. It is armed with a steel spur, as good as Ned Land's harpoon, I imagine." The Canadian did not even trouble to shrug his shoulders. Who had ever heard of attacking cetaceans with a spur? "Wait, Monsieur Anorax," said the captain, "and you will see a novel chase. We need not pity these ferocious beasts. They are only mouth and teeth." All mouth and teeth. No better description of the macrocephalus cachalot could have been given. It is sometimes 70 feet high in length. Its enormous head is fully 1/3 of its body. It is better armed than the whale, whose upper jaw is only furnished with whalebone, while the cachalot has 25 large teeth, about 8 inches long, round and pointed at the top, weighing about 2 pounds each. In the upper part of the enormous head, the valuable spermaceti is found in large quantities. The cachalot is a very disagreeable animal, more tadpole than fish, according to Fredol. It is very badly made, so to speak, and one side is quite a failure, for it can only see with the right eye. Meanwhile, this school of monsters was approaching. They had perceived the whales and hastened to attack them. One could predict victory for the cachalots, not only because they were better fitted for the encounter than their defenseless adversaries, but also because they could remain longer beneath the waves without rising to breathe. There was scarcely time to go to the assistance of the whales. The Nautilus went under water. Conseil, Ned, and I took our places at the windows of the saloon. Captain Nemo stood by the helmsman so as to work the vessel like an engine of destruction. I soon heard the beating of the screw, and our speed increased. The fight had already commenced when the Nautilus arrived on the scene. We steered so as to divide the cachalots. They at first appeared little impressed at the sight of the new monster which had come to take part in the battle, but very soon they had to guard its attack. What a struggle it was! Ned Land, very quickly excited, clapped his hands. The Nautilus was like a tremendous harpoon brandished in the captain's hand. He turned it against the thick, fleshy masses, cutting them asunder, leaving the quivering portions of the animal in the wake. We did not feel the furious blows applied to the side of the Nautilus, nor the shock they produced, to any extent. One cachalot slain, we rushed at another, backing, going ahead or astern, under water or remounting to the surface, and then striking it full or diagonally, cutting or tearing in every direction at all paces, piercing them with the terrible spear. It was a massacre. The noise was prodigious. The hissing and snorting of the enraged animals was deafening. In these usually calm waters, there was enormous waves. For an hour this Homeric Massacre continued. The cachalots could not get away. Frequently 10 or a dozen would get together and attempt to crush the Nautilus beneath their weight. We could see from the window their enormous throats lined with teeth and their formidable eyes. Ned Land threatened and cursed them alternately. We could feel them fasten upon the hull and worry it like wild dogs their prey, but the Nautilus, putting on the steam, would carry them along, either up or down, without heading their enormous bulk or their tremendous pull on the vessel. Heating, sorry. Oh, yeah, totally. That is totally all right. I am a big fan of people, reading along. I know that Drank is planning on doing a Storytime stream as well. There are quite a few Storytime streamers. I am currently on page 254 of my version of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. So I'm in the middle of the second part, chapter 12. I'm about to finish chapter 12. Let's see. Ned Land threatened and cursed them alternately. We could feel... Oh, yeah, I already read that part, sorry. At length the cachalots fled. The sea became calm again. We ascended to the surface. The panels were opened. We hastened to the platform. The ocean was covered with mutilated bodies. A tremendous explosion would not have been more terrible effects. We were floating, surrounded by gigantic corpses. Some cachalots were visible on the horizon in full retreat. The waves were tinged with red for several miles, and we appeared to be sailing in a sea of blood. Captain Nemo now joined us. "Well, Master Land," he said. "Well, sir," replied the Canadian, whose ardor had somewhat abated. "It is really a terrible spectacle, but I am not a butcher myself. I am merely a hunter, and this has been butchery." "It was only a massacre of mischievous animals," replied the captain, "and the Nautilus is not a butcher's knife." "I prefer my harpoon," replied Ned. "Everyone to his own weapon," replied the captain, looking steadily at the Canadian. "Oh, wonderful." Which I have already followed as read by Jamie, so yeah. I was afraid the latter would give way to some violence, which would have deplorable consequences, but his wrath had turned aside by the sight of a whale, which the Nautilus had just reached. The animal had not escaped scot-free from the jaws of the cachalots. I recognized the southern whale by its black and flattened head. Anatomically, it is distinguished from the white and the North Cape whales by the joining of the 7 cervical vertebrae, and it possesses 2 more ribs than the others. This unhappy specimen was lying upon its side, the belly bitten to pieces, quite dead. From a mutilated fin still hung a young whale, which the poor animal could not save from the massacre. The water flowed in and out of its open mouth with a sound like waves breaking on the shore. Captain Nemo guided the Nautilus close to the body. 2 other men then mounted it, and with no little astonishment I saw them draw all the milk from the breasts upon 2 or 3 tons. The captain offered me a glass of the still warm liquid. I could not conceal my repugnance, but he assured me it was excellent, and I could not be in any way distinguished from cow's milk. I tasted it and found he was right. This, therefore, gave us a very useful supply, for cheese and butter would improve our table. From that day I noticed that Ned Land grew more and more badly disposed towards the captain, and I resolved to keep a strict watch on the sayings and doings of the Canadian. So we're between chapters now. He is a really fascinating character. It was pretty forward-thinking, actually, or at least for this time. It's like late 1800s, and there wasn't really that much talk about, conserving nature and that sort of thing. So, yeah, it is really nice to see Captain Nemo's reaction to the the hunting of whales, him getting so upset and frustrated about it, which is nice. Although that was a tough scene to read, the battle with the cachalots. Oh, hang on just a second. All right. Oh, and just so you know, I did mention it in the disclaimer below. All of the books that I do read for Storytime are public domain, so they are all over 100 years old, which means that, their copyrights have expired, and that pretty much anybody can publicly reproduce it and, monetize off of it if they wish. Which I do try to keep very strict about, only the public domains is what I do. And I have all of my past videos of the story times. There's a link below, and it takes you to the playlists, which have them all in order, so you don't have to wonder, okay, where's the next one? All of that. And I think we have enough for one more chapter. Chapter lucky number 13, the icebergs. The Nautilus still continued her southerly course. Was it Captain Nemo's wish to reach the pole? I did think so, for hitherto all such attempts had signally failed. Besides, the reason was too far advanced, as the 13th of March in those latitudes corresponds to the 13th of September in southern climates, when the equinoctial period commences. Upon the 14th of March, I perceived ice floating in latitude 55 degrees, merely field ice, in patches 20 to 25 feet long, upon which the waves broke. The Nautilus remained at the surface. Ned Land, having fished in Arctic seas, was familiar with icebergs. Conseil and I admired them for the first time. Towards the southern horizon, in the air, lay extended a white band of dazzling appearance. This is what English whalers would have called the ice blink. No matter how thick the clouds, they cannot obscure its rays. It betokens the near approach to a pack or flow of ice. And sure enough, blocks of considerable size soon began to make their appearance, whose brilliancy was modified by the caprice of the fogs. Upon some of these masses we could trace green veins, as if caused by sulfate or copper. Others appeared like immense amethysts, through which the light penetrated. Some reflected the rays from the 1,000 facets of their crystals, while others, clouded with vivid calcareous reflections, would have passed for a town of marble. The further we got southward, the greater became the size and frequency of the icebergs. Polar birds built in them by the thousands. Petrels, demiers, and puffins deafened us with their screams. Some of these birds, taking the Nautilus for the dead body of a whale, came to rest upon it and pecked the iron skin. During our progress through the ice, Captain Nemo kept upon the deck. He took note of these desolate places. I perceived his calm face light up now and then. Was he thinking how much at home he was in these polar seas, denied to other men? Perhaps so, but he did not speak. He piloted the Nautilus with consummate skill, avoiding skillfully any encounter with those masses, some of which were many miles long and of a height varying from 200 to 250 feet. The horizon often appeared entirely shut in. At the 60 degrees of latitude all passage seemed barred, but the captain, after a careful search, found a narrow opening through which he glided boldly, knowing very well, however, that it would close in on his wake. Thus the Nautilus skillfully steered past all this ice, classed with a precision that delighted Conseil, according to their forms or size. Icebergs or mountain, ice fields or united in apparently boundless expanses, drifted ice or packs, then when circular called palches, or streams which they had lengthened out. The temperature was very low. The thermometer marked 2 degrees or 3 degrees below zero in the open air, but we were warmly clad in furs, at the cost of the seal and sea bear. The interior of the Nautilus, warmed by the electric apparatus, defied the most intense cold. Besides, we had only to go under the water a few yards to find a comfortable temperature. 2 months earlier, we should have enjoyed perpetual day in these latitudes, but now we had 3 or 4 hours night, and later 6 months darkness would envelop these circumpolar regions. On the 15th March, we passed the latitude of islands of New Zealand and the South Orkneys. The captain informed me that at one time quantities of seals inhabited these islands, but the English and American whalers, in their zeal for killing, massacred males and females indiscriminately, and where one life had been, after their departure was the silence of death. On the 16th March, about 8 a.m., the Nautilus crossed the Antarctic Circle. Ice lay all round us, and closed in upon the horizon. Nevertheless, the captain still kept on towards the pole. "But where can he be going?" I asked Conseil. "Ahead," he replied, "and when he cannot get any further, he will stop." "I wouldn't swear to that," I said. And to tell the truth, I was not displeased at this adventurous kind of life. I cannot express the degree of pleasure I experienced in these novel regions. The ice assumed the most impressive and beautiful forms. Here was an oriental town with innumerable mosques and minarets, there a city thrown headlong to the ground by some natural convulsion. These appearances were continually varied by the oblique rays of the sun, or lost amid the gray mists and hurricanes of snow. On all sides were the detonations and the sounds of the falls of great masses of ice, which changed the aspect at once, like the passing scene of a diorama. Whenever these falls took place, while the Nautilus was under water, the noise was astounding to our ears, and the waves were moved even to the lowest depths. At these times, the Nautilus rolled and pitched like an abandoned vessel at sea. On several occasions, as I could not discover any exit, I thought we were actually hemmed in by the ice, but as if it were by instinct, Captain Nemo would always hit upon a passage. He was never mistaken when he could see the little blue rivulets trickling through the ice field. I had now no doubt that he had already ventured into these Antarctic seas. However, on the 16th March, the ice stopped us completely. Not icebergs, but vast ice fields. This could not stop the captain, however, and he rushed into the ice with tremendous speed. The Nautilus penetrated like a wedge into this brittle mass, dividing it with loud cracking. It was like the old battering ram impelled with tremendous power. The fragments of ice thrown high in the air round us like hail, fell round us like hail. By its own impulsive force, the Nautilus made a channel through it. Sometimes carried forward by its impetus, it rose over the ice and crushed it beneath its weight. Sometimes, when beneath the ice field, it broke it up by a simple pitching movement. All this time, we encountered violent squalls, and the thick fogs prevented us seeing from one end of the platform to the other. The wind blew sharply all around the compass, and the snow lay so thickly that we had to break it up with pickaxes. The temperature was steady at 5 degrees below zero, and the Nautilus was completely covered with ice. An ordinary vessel would not have worked her way through, and the rigging would have been frozen in the blocks and pulleys. Such a ship as ours was the only chance for success. Under these circumstances, the barometer kept very low. It fell even to 73 degrees 5 minutes. The compass gave us no guarantee. The erring needles marked contrary directions as we approached the south meridional pole, which must not be confounded with the south pole of the earth. According to Hostin, this pole is situated close to 70 degrees latitude and 130 degrees longitude, and according to the observations of Duperrey, in 135 degrees longitude and 70 degrees 30 minutes latitude. We were therefore obliged to make numerous observations and move the compasses from place to place in the ship to get a meridian. But frequently they trusted to the reckoning to make out the course we had run, a very unsatisfactory method in the midst of these wandering passes, in which the landmarks were constantly changed. At length, the Nautilus was actually blocked on the 18th March. There were no longer streams, packs, nor fields, but an immovable, interminable barrier formed by mountains of ice wedged together. "An iceberg," said Ned Land to me. I knew that to Ned Land, like all other navigators, this was insurmountable. The sun appeared at noon for an instant, and Captain Nemo obtained an observation which gave our position as 51 degrees 30 minutes longitude and 67 degrees 39 minutes south latitude. We were now a point more advanced in the Antarctic region. We were unable to obtain even a glimpse of sea. Before the Nautilus lay a vast, confused plain heaped with ice blocks, with all the capricious pell-mell confusion with which characterizes the surface of a river before the ice thaws on it. But on an immense scale, here and there sharp peaks and delicate needle points raised themselves to the height of 200 feet. Farther on was a long line of cliffs hewn out into great peaks and of grayish tint, vast mirrors which reflected the half-obscured sunbeams. The dread silence was scarcely disturbed by the flapping of the sea-bird's wings. Everything, even the noise, seemed frozen up. The Nautilus was obliged to halt in her adventurous course in the midst of the ice field. "Monsieur," said Ned Land to me one day, "if this captain of yours goes any further—" "Well, he will be something very wonderful." "Why, Ned?" "Because no one ever crossed an iceberg. Captain Nemo is powerful, but confound him, he is not stronger than nature, and where she has placed bounds, he must stop willy-nilly." "Just go, Ned, and I should like to know what is behind this iceberg." Just so, Ned. I should like to know what is behind this iceberg. A wall, that is what irritates me more." "Monsieur is quite right," said Conseil. "Walls are only invented to irritate savants. There never ought to be any walls." "Well," said the Canadian, "they know very well what is behind this iceberg." "What?" "Ice. Nothing but ice." "You appear certain about that, Ned," I replied. "But I'm not at all sure, and that is why I want to see." "Then, sir, you may relinquish the idea. You have reached the iceberg, which is quite enough, and neither you nor Captain Nemo nor this Nautilus will go any further, and whether he will or not, you must go northwards again, that is to say, amongst honest people." Notwithstanding all our efforts, notwithstanding the most powerful means employed to break up the ice, the Nautilus remained motionless. Usually, in like cases, this progress is impossible. The return path is open, but in this case to return was as impracticable as to advance, for all passages were closed astern, and if our vessel remained stationary for a little, it would be at once blocked up. This usually happened about 2 o'clock p.m., and the young ice formed round us with surprising rapidity. I was obliged to confess that Captain Nemo had been more than imprudent. I was on the platform at the time. The captain, who had been taking in the situation for some time, said to me, "Well, Professor, what do you think of this?" "I think we are prisoners, Captain." "Prisoners? And how do you make that out?" "I mean, as we can neither move backwards nor forwards, nor to either side, that is being a prisoner, at least in civilized countries, it is so considered." "So, Monsieur Anorax, you think that the Nautilus cannot get away?" "It will be very difficult, at least for the season is already too far advanced to give you any hope of a temporary break-up of the ice." "Monsieur Anorax," replied the captain in an ironical tone of voice, "you will always be the same. You see nothing but obstacles and difficulties in the way. But I not only assert that the Nautilus will disengage herself, but that she will go farther on." "Further south?" I asked, gazing at the captain. "Yes, she will go to the pole." "To the pole?" I exclaimed incredulously. "Yes," the captain replied coldly, "to the Antarctic pole, to that unknown point from which every meridian of the earth springs. You are aware that I can do as I please with the Nautilus." "Yes, I did know that. I knew this man was bold to recklessness. But to overcome the obstacles surrounding the South Pole, more inaccessible than the North Pole, which had not yet been discovered by the most hardy explorers, was to carry out a mad idea, and one which only the mind of a madman could conceive. It then occurred to me that to ask Captain Nemo whether he had already discovered the pole, which had never yet been touched by human foot. "No, Professor," he replied, "we will discover it together, where other people have failed. I shall not fail. I have never hitherto driven my Nautilus so far over the southern seas, but I repeat, I shall go farther still." "I wish to believe you, Captain," I replied with a playful irony. "I do believe you. Let us get on. There is nothing to hinder us. Let us smash up this iceberg, blow it to pieces if it resists. Let us give the Nautilus her wings to fly over it." "Over it, Professor?" said the captain calmly. "Not over it. Under it." "Under it?" I exclaimed. A sudden revelation of the captain's plans flashed into my mind. I understood it all. The wonderful qualities of the Nautilus were once again to serve in a superhuman enterprise. "I perceive we are beginning to understand each other, Professor," said the captain, smiling. "You already see the possibility, nay, the success of our attempt. What to an ordinary vessel is impracticable, to the Nautilus is easy of accomplishment. If a continent is around the pole, we must stop at the continent, but if, on the contrary, the open sea leaves it, we shall run up to the pole itself." "In fact," I said, quite carried away by the captain's reasoning, "if the surface of the sea is solidified by ice, the lower depths are free, in consequence of the natural law that has fixed the maximum density of salt water or 1 degree hither than freezing point. And if I am right, the submerged portion of this iceberg is to the part out of the water as 4-to-1. "Very nearly, Professor. For 1 foot of iceberg above the water, there are, as a rule, 3 below. Now, since these icy mountains are never more than 300 feet high, they are not more than 900 feet below, and what is the depth of 900 feet to the Nautilus? Nothing at all. We could even seek at a greater depth the equable temperature of seawater, and disdain 30 degrees or 40 degrees of surface cold." "Quite so," I assented. "The only difficulty for us," said Captain Nemo, "will be to remain many days under water without renewing our supply of fresh air." "Oh, is that all?" I cried. "Why, the Nautilus has immense reservoirs and can supply us all with oxygen we shall require." "Happy thought, Monsieur Anorax," replied the captain, smiling. "But as I do not want you to think me reckless, I will submit to my objections in advance." Have you any more? Only one. It is possible that if there be sea around the South Pole, it may be frozen, and in that case we should not be able to return to the surface at all. Very well, but you forget that the Nautilus is armed with a sharp spur, and cannot we cut our way diagonally through the ice, which would give way before us? Certainly, Professor, you are brilliant today. Besides, Captain, I added enthusiastically, we may not find the sea free at the South Pole as well as at the North. The ice poles and the Earth's poles are not the same on either hemisphere, and until there is proof adduced to the contrary, we may fairly assume that there is a continent or an ocean free from ice of these extremities of the globe. I agree with you, Monsieur Anorax, replied the captain. I would hint to you, however, that after first making all kinds of objections to my plan, you are not now overwhelming me with arguments in favor of it. Captain Nemo only spoke the truth. I had been out-Heroding Herod. It was I who was taking him to the pole. I was going ahead of him altogether. But no, poor fool Captain Nemo knows better than you the pros and cons of this question, and it only amused him to see you carried away by visions of the impossible. All the same, he had not lost a minute. At a signal the mate appeared. These two then conversed rapidly in their incomprehensible language, and whether the mate had been previously warned or whether he believed the project impracticable, he at any rate showed no surprise. But impassible as he was, he did not come up to Conseil in that respect, for when I announced to him our intention to reach the South Pole, he merely said, "Just as Monsieur pleases," and I had to be content with that. As for Ned Land, if ever shoulders were lifted, they were those of the Canadians. "Look here, sir," said Ned Land, "I pity you and your captain." "But we are going to the pole, Master Ned." "Well, you may go there, but you will never come back again." And Ned Land went to his cabin, so as not to make a disturbance, he said as he left me. Meanwhile, the preparations for this rash expedition were commenced. The powerful pumps filled the reservoirs with air and stowed it at a high pressure. About 4 o'clock, Captain Nemo informed me that the panels in the platform were about to be closed. I took a last look at the thick iceberg which we were about to penetrate. The weather was fine, the atmosphere clear, the cold piercing, 12 degrees below zero. But as there was no wind, this cold was bearable. A dozen men, armed with axes, cut away the ice round the Nautilus. This was soon done, and the young ice was still thin. We all descended into the interior. The usual reservoirs were filled with water, and the Nautilus quickly sank. I sat with Conseil in the saloon. Through the open window we could inspect the lower beds of the Southern Ocean. The thermometer rose. The needle of the manometer deviated on the dial plate. At about 300 yards down, as the captain had anticipated, we were floating below the moving icebergs, but the Nautilus went lower still. It reached 800 yards depth. The temperature of the water was 12 degrees at the surface. Down here, it was only 10 degrees. 2 degrees had already been gained. Of course, the temperature of the Nautilus was maintained at a higher level by 1 degree by its heating apparatus. All its movements were executed with wondrous precision. "If Monsieur please, I think we shall get through," said Conseil. "I quite expect so," I replied in a tone of conviction. In this open water, the Nautilus steered directly for the pole without quitting the 52nd meridian. From 67 degrees 30 minutes to 90 degrees 23.5 minutes of latitude remained to be got over, or a little more than 500 leagues. The average speed was 28 miles an hour. At this rate, we should reach the pole in 40 hours. For a portion of the night, the novelty of the situation kept us at the windows of the saloon. The sea was lit by the electric lamp, but it was deserted. Fish could not live in those prison waters. They could only find a passage here from the Antarctic Ocean to the open polar sea. Our progress was rapid, as we could feel by the quivering of the hull. About 2:00 a.m., I retired to snatch some sleep, and Conseil did likewise. On my way, I did not meet Captain Nemo. I supposed he was in the pilot house. Next morning, 19th of March, I again took my place at the window. The speed of the Nautilus had been diminished. We were ascending, prudently emptying the reservoirs, but slowly my heart beat fast. Were we about to emerge and breathe fresh air around the pole? No. A shock told me that the Nautilus had struck the underside of the iceberg, still very thick judging from the sound. We had touched bottom, to use a sea term, but in the inverse sense, and at 1,000 feet below. This would give us 2,000 feet of ice above us, of which 1,000 feet were above the sea level. So the iceberg must be thicker now than when we started, which was not a very cheerful conclusion to arrive at. Many times during the day the Nautilus tried the ice, and always with the same success. At certain times it encountered this icy ceiling at a depth of 900 yards, which gave a thickness of 1,000 yards in all, 200 being above the sea level. The ice was double the thickness of the surface now than it had been when we first plunged beneath it. I noted these different depths carefully, and thus contained a submarine profile of this chain of mountains, as it were developed under the water. By the evening no change had taken place. Ice everywhere, between 400 and 500 yards deep. The thickness was diminishing, but what a depth yet remained between us and the surface of the ocean. It was 8 o'clock. At 4 o'clock the air of the Nautilus should have been renewed as usual. However, I did not suffer much, though no demand had been made on the reservoirs for a supply of oxygen. I slept but little that night. Hope and fear assailed me by turns. I got up many times. The Nautilus continued to tap the ice. Towards 3 a.m. I noticed that the lower surface of the icebergs were only 50 yards down. Only 150 feet now separated us from the surface. The iceberg was rapidly becoming an ice field. The mountain was dropping to a plain. My eyes never left the manometer. We kept ascending steadily and diagonally. The surrounding surfaces glittered beneath our electric light. The ice was getting thinner both above and below, mile after mile. At length, at 6 o'clock a.m. on this memorable 19th March, Captain Nemo opened the door of the saloon and said, "We are in open water." All right, so we have reached the end of the chapter and the end of our story time. But if you'd like to stick around, I'm going to be doing a game stream. I'm going to try to first get past opening the balloon on Luna before I decide if we're going to be playing that or playing another game, perhaps. So just going to take a couple of minutes, take a small break, refresh the voice, all of that. And then I'll let you know in chat when to refresh when I start my stream back up. Anyways, thank you so much for hanging out with me, Drank and Yummy. Is it Yummy or Yumi? Or I could just say Rocks. And yes, next story time is tomorrow. I did get the couple of days off that I was wanting. So tomorrow we're going to be finishing The Phantom of the Opera. And then Sunday doing a watch-along of the Lon Chaney movie, which I'm very excited about. I've never done a live watch-along, so we'll see. Anyways, hope to see you in a few minutes. And if not, see you next time. Bye.